Hello friends, welcome to this online refresher course that is a concerns in educational research and assessment under ARPIT 2019. I am Arvind Kumar Jha from Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, Lucknow, and extending my greetings to you all on behalf of National Resource Center for Education, that is NRC for Education, Central University of South Bihar, Gaya. I am here to discuss with you on a very important and relevant topic, that is interpretation of interpretation. We'll discuss this topic in two parts. Part 1 consists of certain pertinent questions. Number 1, how to describe the purpose of the interpretations, conclusions and recommendations and implications, part of the discussion section of your research report writing, and how to differentiate each from the other. Second one will be how to identify the research problem and methodological topics which can be addressed in the interpretation section. Number 3, how to describe the important issues related to each topic. And the fourth, what are the limitations that can temper the conclusions drawn by a researcher? And fifth, why to differentiate population validity from ecological validity and discuss why each is an important consideration in evaluating the conclusions of the researchers. How to identify the criteria for evaluating a discussion section of the research report and how to use this criteria to evaluate the discussion section of a published research study. Now, firstly, let us discuss about number 1, how to describe the purpose of the interpretations, conclusions and recommendations and implications parts of the discussion section of a research report, how to differentiate each from the other, how to identify the research problem and methodological topics which can be addressed in the interpretation section, how to describe the important issues related to each topic. Friends, we are going to discuss some of the very important topics, that is interpretation of interpretation, because this is the chapter which is the most significant chapter in anyone's research. Interpretation of interpretation is a concern with some of the pertinent questions like what is the purpose of the discussion section of a research report and what are major parts of this section. How to describe the purpose of interpretations, conclusions and recommendations and implications part of the discussion section of a research report. How to differentiate each from the other. How to identify the research problem and methodological topics which can be addressed in the interpretation section, not where you wrote. Now, how to describe the important issues related to each topic. What are limitations that can be tempered, that conclusions drawn by a researcher? Why to differentiate population validity from ecological validity and discuss why each is an important consideration in evaluating the conclusions of the researchers. how to identify the criteria for evaluating a discussion section of the research report, not only others but yours also, and how to use this criteria to evaluate the discussion section of the published research study. Any published research study, it could be yours or it could be somebody else. So start with the first concern. The first concern was the purpose and nature of the discussion section of a research report. What is the purpose? Why, after doing all research, right, you write this section, which you generally called interpretation, conclusion, and recommendations? What is the purpose? The purpose of the discussion section is, to my mind, to present an interpretation of the results and to interpret the conclusions and describe it, and finally recommendations for further study, because your study is not one-time phenomena. It has to be on a continuum. Somebody else will refer your study, and suppose your research is a very, very influential one, somebody would like to extend that study. Therefore, let's discuss the purposes in detail. An evaluation of the methodology and results to help readers understand what the results mean and how they can be used. I repeat, here the purpose is to provide an evaluation of the methodology that you have used and the results to help readers understand what the results mean and how they can be used. And you should not forget that you are not writing your thesis only to be evaluated by an examiner. No, you are writing your thesis, and particularly this chapter, so that others can read it and understand it. Because once you are awarded PhD degree, that thesis becomes a public property. Though intellectual property right, it comes under intellectual property right, but anybody is free to see your thesis. So everybody has a right to understand it. So to make it understandable, right, you present an evaluation of your own methodology and results to help the readers understand what the results mean and how can they be used. And that's more important. It's not only the meaning of the results, but how further those results can be used. The second important purpose is it integrates the research problems, review of the literature and results. But actually what you do? You write the research problems in one chapter, you write the review of related literature somewhere else, and then you write the results somewhere else. But this is the place where you provide all the three components of your research in an integrated way. Like sometimes I really get frustrated to see people do the review of related literature, extensive review of related literature, but they fail to identify the research gaps, and they fail to say what methodological weakness was there and how that can be substituted by other methodologies, etc., etc. It speculates about the implications of the results through a synthesis of the study reflecting the professional judgment of the researcher. And here you are judged by your professional competence as a researcher. So this section, now generally you will find, if you scan through different research report writing, different theses in India, you will find this section is loosely structured into two sections. Number one, interpretation of the results and the conclusion. Sometimes there are three also. Separately people write educational implications or the implications. But let me, for the time being, concentrate on the two loosely structured, structures of this chapter. What is the one? The first one is the interpretation of the results and the conclusion. That's why I have called this topic the interpretation of the interpretation. So interpretation of the results and then the conclusion. Now let us discuss the interpretation of the results first, and then we'll talk about the interpretation of the conclusions. See, when we talk about interpretation of the results, what is this? This is nothing but an analysis of the results. Fine. What else? Is it simply an analysis of the results? No. It is an analysis of the results focusing on factors that might help explain them better. So it's not only simple analysis, but you will have to focus on those factors which might help to explain them in a better way. And therefore, interpretations related to the problem you will have to write here. Interpretation related to the objectives you have to write here. Interpretations related to the hypothesis you have to write here. So their problem, objectives, hypothesis you have written. But here you will have to justify with your own interpretation after doing entire research. So what we should do while writing interpretations related to the problem or hypothesis? You should do following things. Number one, this is the place you should do restatement of the research questions. So this is the space, or this is the place which provides you an opportunity. If something is there in your mind after conducting your research, you have here the opportunity to restate or to make a restatement of the research questions that you formulated earlier. Second, interpretation of how well the data answers the questions, and that you should write. Whether the data you collected, and on the basis of data, if you have drawn some conclusions, so this is the place where you have to write the interpretation of how well the data answers the questions. And the third point, which is very important, that is importance of the reader's critical analysis of these interpretations. I repeat, importance of the reader's critical analysis of these interpretations. See what will happen whenever a researcher, the future researcher, or any reader who has got the interest in any research done under the sky, you know, when he or she studies this chapter, he will always apply the critical understanding, the critical analytical perspective, and therefore you have to be very careful regarding the importance of reader's critical analysis of these interpretations. But what happens mostly? Simply people write from their own perspective. I mean, this research report, this is your research related to a particular problem, but ultimately this is going into the public domain where all are free to use it. So you need to keep those things in your mind. Friends, now we'll discuss interpretations related to methodology. Generally, somewhere else you have written, third chapter or fourth chapter, you have written that, okay, it is a survey method, or you can say it is a method X, method Y, method Z that has been used to conduct this research. But here, in this section of your research thesis, what you should do? And that's why interpretation related to methodology is very important. You should write at least 4 things regarding interpretation of methodology in this section, friends. Number 1, you must write about the selection of the subjects. Suppose some people say, my sample was 200. Somebody writes, my sample was 250. Why? Why not 300? Why not 400? Etc. etc. So, selection of the subjects. And then, when you write the selection of the subjects, you have to write the subject's characteristics, why you prefer to choose subject A over the subject B. Why did you choose to prefer sample from the district A, not from the sample from the district B, or from the sample from a state A, not from the sample from the state B. So you'll have to interpret, give the interpretation. Second, so here your job is very critical. You have to take care of your own subjects. At the same time, you'll have to simultaneously act as a reader. That, okay, when reader is reading my report, what kind of questions will come in their mind, the reader's mind. Second, So first, what you should do, you should you should interpret here about the selection of the subjects. The second, measurement of variables. Here you'll have to write some interpretation of the measurement of variables. Third, if it is experimental research, experimental treatments. And fourth, you must not forget, if it's a quantitative research, maybe the general statistical techniques, or maybe the sophisticated statistical techniques you must have used. So you must interpret about the statistical procedures. Like, why did you choose F test instead of T test? Or why did you choose T test over F test? Why did you choose M and COBA instead of simple and COBA, etc., etc.? So statistical procedures, the interpretation of a statistical procedure, you must write. Now the question is, I'm not going to discuss in detail when you're interpreting about subjects, variables, experimental treatments and statistical procedures. But let me focus about the statistical procedures. While writing statistical procedures and while discussing about statistical procedures, what you should do? I'm not saying in chapter 3, but I'm saying the last chapter, where you are interpreting the things, you are discussing the things about your research findings, conclusions and implications. So therefore, friends, my humble suggestion is, while writing statistical procedures and discussing about statistical procedures, you must write about, number 1, errors in reporting statistical results. Number 2, violation of assumptions of the statistical procedures if it has been done. You should not hesitate. Third, use of appropriate statistical procedures, particularly in multivariate studies. And last but not the least, friends, statistical and practical significance. Why? Because you all know, anything and everything which is statistically significant, not necessarily that is a practically significant also. For example, two people have achieved some marks and the mean difference is hardly less than 1% or less than even that. I mean, statistically significance is there, but practically it's not much significant. You should also write about consideration of effect size of coefficients of determination. That's very important. You should also discuss, while interpreting your results in the light of previous research, and that's why you do review of related literature. It's not that once you have done review of related literature, the job is over. Here, you have to interpret, you have to discuss your findings and conclusions in the light of previous research. Whether it is just supporting those, your data is supporting those previous research, or even not supporting those previous research. Why? Because it's not necessary all replicable research will generate similar findings. But interpretation has to be there. You'll have to write in an interpretation manner. Now, before moving over to conclusions, let us summarize things about interpretation of results. We should discuss and write an analysis of the results, focusing on factors that might help explain them. Discuss interpretations related to the problem and or hypothesis. Discuss interpretation related to methodology, and finally discuss results in the light of previous research. Now I'll be talking about the conclusion section, friends. See, as far as conclusion section is concerned, we should do what? Generally, for this, what we do, we look into others' research thesis or the way our research supervisor guides us. It's good that every point of your research, you must consult your research supervisor and take feedback from other people who have already conducted researches in that area or who are good researchers in their own field. Don't hesitate. So here the question is what we should do when we are writing the sections of the conclusion section in this chapter. Number one, you must write or you must provide summary statements of the results as they pertain to the research problem, which can be found in various locations in the discussion section. Like in discussion section, at various places you have made certain statements about the results, but here when you are discussing the conclusion, particularly you are trying to interpret the conclusion aspects of your research, you must provide here the summary statements of the results as they pertain to the research problem, which can be found in various locations in the discussion section. It should include indications of why the conclusions are supported, or maybe why the conclusions are not supported. For detail, for this I would like to advise you, you can refer for Trossim's discussions of conclusion validity. Please do see that, please do refer that if you are planning to conduct any research in near future, or you are conducting your research and going to write this section of your thesis or your research report, whether it is a funded or you are doing usual MPhil PhD kind of courses. This is the one. Second, limitations. You must write about the limitations, and don't write limitations in the form of time was short, fund was not available, accessibility was not there. I don't understand why people write all these things. There are 7 factors or there are 7 variables that need to be considered in using the conclusions, friends, when particularly you are writing about the limitations. The first, subject characteristics. Very important, but hardly people write about that. Under this, you must write about population validity. What is a population validity? Population validity is that which is nothing but the generalizability to other individuals. And when you're writing about this, the comparison of the sample, sampling frame and target population you must interpret. So first, comparison of the sample, sampling frame and target population. Comparisons across subjects within the sample. Why? Because suppose you have 50 samples or 500 samples, what do you think? All subjects are equal? No. Questionnaire is same for all. But what do you think? The response, why responses are different? Because the subjects are different. And therefore it is important to have the comparison of the sample, sampling frame and target population. Not only that, you should have the comparisons across subjects within the sample. Second point, which is very important, situational characteristics. Hardly people write in this section or interpret anything about situational characteristics. When we talk about the situational characteristics, the first thing that comes in our mind as a researcher is ecological validity. Now, what is ecological validity? Ecological validity is generalization to other settings. Generalization to not only settings, but the time and the treatments or the measures. So, this is the right opportunity to interpret ecological validity of research, and that is nothing but the generalization to other settings, times, treatments or measures. Also, you should write about the methodology, particularly when it is a non-experimental designs drawing causal conclusions, and experimental studies drawing causal conclusions when internal validity is weak. This happens, and that's why this is the right place where you have to write in an interpretive mode, that if it is a non-experimental designs and you are drawing causal conclusions, you must write here. And second, if it is experimental studies and drawing causal conclusions, nothing is wrong. But particularly in the situation when internal validity is weak. You should also write about the time. You should also write about the treatment. You should also write, and when you are writing about the treatments, please keep in mind the explication of the treatment. What does it mean? For this, I'll advise you go for the Hawthorne's effect. The effects of the individuals realizing they are participating in a study, and the measures, validity and reliability. All these things you have to write here, but you have to write all these things in an interpretive mode, not simply descriptive mode. Friends, now I'll be talking about the recommendations and implications. When generally people write in the thesis about the recommendations and implications, what they are supposed to do. Recommendations and implications, strategies suggesting future action as a result of the study. I repeat, statements suggesting future action as a result of the study. What does it mean? So I have seen people are saying, okay, if it has been done in state X, it should be done in a state Y. If it has been done at the secondary level, it should be done at the post-secondary level. Friends, I have a suggestion for that. When you are writing the recommendation and implications from the interpretation point of view, then the statement must suggest for future action as a result of the study, keeping in mind the focus on methodological issues. That yes, this study has been done using X methodology, this study can be done using methodology Y and Z as well. And second, you should also focus on the practice. Yes, I'm aware that all recommendations and implications or cannot be written in the form of focus on practice, because all research problems are directly may or may not be related with the practicality of it. Now in the end, friends, very important, suppose you have written your chapter keeping all the above mentioned points that we have just discussed right now. What do you think? Now you should not do anything? Still there is scope that you must do something. And what's that? And that's why it is a right time to talk about criteria for evaluating the discussion and conclusion sections of the research report. This will help you not only to evaluate what you have written right now in your thesis, but in future it will help you to evaluate that section of the research thesis or the research report of any individual. Or maybe in future, when you become an examiner to examine a particular thesis, there also you can apply this criteria for evaluating the discussion and conclusion sections of the research report. So what are those? What is the first criteria? So the first criteria in the form of question you can set for yourself, or you can keep simply in your mind, or you can keep in a written form in front of you. Number one, the results should be adequately interpreted. Whether the results that are reported here, those results have been interpreted adequately or not. Most of the times results are simply reported, they are not interpreted. So reporting the result and interpreting the results, there is a difference between the two. And for this, I am reminded of one simple story, may not be the correct story, but just to make you understand what happens. You know, most of the times, if you are not intelligent enough, you are not applying your logic to interpret correctly the right and the correct logic, the results, or particularly the interpretation of the results or the finding could be dangerous. I'm reminded of a story that one researcher wanted to understand the correlation between the hearing capacity and the jumping capacity of a frog. So the researcher, what he did, he found one frog, very healthy, hearty, sturdy, and the researcher trained the frog. And after training, he could notice that the moment he used to have a stick in his hand and say tick and jump, combining these sounds, the frog used to jump 1 meter. So after doing this experiment, he found that this jump cannot jump in one go more than 1 meter. Now I thought this is the right time to start experimenting my hypothesis. And the simple objective was that, the research question is, what is a correlation between the hearing capacity and the jumping capacity of the frog? So what he did, he cut one leg of the frog and he said jump, and obviously the frog was in pain and he had lost one leg also, so he could not jump up to the 1 meter. So he noted down the readings. He took the second reading after cutting the second leg. Then he took the third reading after cutting the third leg. Then again he took the fourth reading after cutting the fourth leg. And on the basis of that, he found that gradually the hearing capacity was going on. So his conclusion was, as the hearing capacity goes down, the jumping capacity also goes down. Actually, he was still hearing. The frog was capable to hear it. But since the frog had lost all its 4 legs, the frog could not jump. This is simply a joke. But this kind of blunder, we researchers, most of the time while conducting research, we commit. And that's why we need to be logically conscious while interpreting any results. And that's why the first criteria is whether the results have been adequately interpreted or not. And that's why the first criteria I have mentioned. The second criteria, the conclusions should answer the research questions. So my another submission, I'm very happy to see some of the Indian universities, instead of writing objectives, they simply write research questions. And if it is a quantitative and experimental research, they simply write hypothesis, possibility A or possibility B. So the conclusions should answer the research questions. That's the second criteria you need to keep in mind while evaluating any research report, particularly the chapter of the research report which talks about findings, conclusions, discussions, and implications. Third, the conclusions should be limited by subject characteristics and selection, the nature of the treatment and measures. I repeat, the conclusions should be limited by subject characteristics and selection, the nature of the treatments and measures. Fourth, statistical and practical significance are discussed separately. Statistically, they report something, they report the result also, but unfortunately, majority of our PhD thesis in education, these two sections are not interpreted adequately, and that's why I'm suggesting the very important criteria is statistical and practical significance are discussed separately. Next, failure to show statistical significance does not mean there is a not relationship or difference. I repeat, friends. Failure to show statistical significance does not mean there is a not relationship or there is a no relationship or there is a no difference. The next criteria that you keep in mind while evaluating this chapter or this section of your research report writing or your PhD thesis, that limitations should be reasonable. As I said earlier, don't write unreasonable limitations. Please do mention limitations in terms of reasonability. If it's not reasonable, please don't mention. So limitations should be reasonable. And the next, which is very important, that is the recommendations and implications should be specific. I mean, it is really frustrating to see after doing 2 years or 3 years of hard work of research, when they write recommendations, it is observed and it is felt. What is the use of this research? I mean, this common sense recommendation can be made or could have been made without conducting such research. Why? Because those recommendations and implications are so general that they cannot be used practically. I would like to advise that one of the most important criteria of evaluating this chapter or this section of your entire research report should be that the recommendations and implications should be specific in nature. So friends, in this part of the discussion, we discussed about number 1, how to describe the purpose of the interpretation, conclusion and recommendations and implications part of the discussion section of the research report, and how to differentiate each from the other. Number 2, we discussed how to identify the research problems and methodological topics which can be addressed in the interpretation sections. 3, how to describe the important issues related to each topic. This is all about this part. I hope that you have enjoyed this session. Once again, we shall meet in the next part of the presentation, in which we shall discuss what are limitations that can temper the conclusions drawn by a researcher, why to differentiate population validity from ecological validity, and discuss why each is an important consideration in evaluating the conclusions of the researchers. 6, how to identify the criteria for evaluating a discussion section of a research report and how to use this criteria to evaluate the discussion section of a published research study. Namaskar.